Hello and welcome to my three-part review series on the Mosin Nagant 91/30 rifle. This section will be part 1 of 3, and it's meant for folks that are completely unfamiliar with this weapon, having just bought one, or are thinking about buying one, or are just wanting to familiarize themselves with the Mosin Nagant rifle family in general. And this will cover the basics: loading, unloading, bolt operation, bolt takedown and maintenance, things of that nature. Part 2 will cover accessories and a little bit about the ammunition itself. And Part 3, last but not least, will cover the history and the mechanics of this weapon. The Mosin Nagant 91/30 series of rifles was adopted by the Soviet Union in 1930 as a modification to the existing M1891 Mosin Nagant rifle, specifically the Dragoon, and I'll get into that a bit later. And the 91/30 gave rise to the M38 carbine and the M44 carbine, and production ended in 1945 with a total production tally of approximately 17 million between 1930 and 1945. They soldiered on afterwards into the Cold War era in the hands of all those other countries that somehow fell within the shadow of Soviet political domination, if you will: Poland, Hungary, China, North Korea, etc. As rifles, their early design, 1891, shows, and it's not as compared to the Mauser 98 or the later Lee Enfields, it doesn't compare as favorably, but they are very solid rifles that will hold their own. They're very cheap and plentiful, which is why a lot of folks buy them. Ammo is very cheap as well. And we'll examine the rifle a bit more in depth now. Before working the action anywhere, you should always make sure that the weapon is unloaded and pointed in a safe direction. I already got both covered here in my basements, but just to show you, the way you would check to make sure it's unloaded would be to work the bolt back and inspect the magazine in the chamber. So to do that, I lift the bolt, pull it to the rear, and then I would inspect the magazine, which is empty, and the chamber, which is empty. I always use the pinky check just because it's the way I was taught, number 1, and number 2, it works under any light condition. By performing the safety check, you have already learned how to work the action halfway. Normally, when you open the bolts, that serves the purpose of cocking the bolt, meaning it compresses the spring and moves the cocking piece to the rear. As you can see, this is the cocking piece here. Retracting the bolt normally ejects the spent case, and then pushing it forward, chambers a new round, and down rotates the bolt into the firing position, so you're good to fire. So I'll demonstrate that with these two spent cases here. So open the bolts, load, and then if the rounds decide to cooperate, spent rounds have a tendency to pop out to the right or up. So fire, eject the round, fire again, eject. And there you go. The safety on the Mosin Nagant is a bit crude, perhaps unsafe at times, but to operate it the way you would is first you have to kind of cock the bolts, and to cock the bolt you can either, as I mentioned earlier, open the bolt, or you can just pull back on the cocking piece using your fingers. You'll hear a click like that. Now, to operate the safety, you have to pull back on the cocking piece and twist to the left, like that. It locks the bolt in place, and you cannot obviously fire the weapon, or at least you should not be able to fire the weapon. I say it's a bit crude and perhaps sometimes unsafe, because sometimes when I first got the rifle, I would pull back not all the way and I would leave it here. The problem is, sometimes you might just catch, instead of catching into the groove, there's a groove in there, you might catch it on just like the outer bit and thinking that it's safe, when really a quick bump will knock it back into the firing position. And then of course there's a possibility for a unintentional discharge. And to disengage the safety, just do the reverse. Pull out and then rotate it back into its original position. Now that you've learned how to operate the bolt, I suppose it's time that you learn how to take it out of the rifle and disassemble it for maintenance and cleaning and the like. But before you do, make sure you have your toolkit with you, because inside your toolkit you'll have a particular piece, this one here, that measures firing pin protrusion with these notches here. And that's because every time you take apart the bolts of the Mosin Nagant, there's always the chance you could change the depth of the firing pin, the depth that it protrudes out of the bolt face. Too much and you'll have punctured primers. Too little and you'll have you'll have unreliable ignition or no ignition at all. So to take the bolt out of the rifle, obviously make sure that it's pointed in a safe direction and that it's unloaded. But what you do is you pull the bolt back and then pull on the trigger and then just take the bolt out of the rifle. So now that you have your bolt in front of you, you can finally take it apart. To do that, you have to put it into the uncocked position, which is there. So hold everything in place, pull back on the cocking piece, and make sure that the guide rail is still connected to the sear. While doing this, pull and then twist to the left. It should go into the uncocked position, which you can see the firing pin has extended forward. And then we'll need this piece to measuring firing pin protrusion after we're done with all this. But in the uncocked position, the bolt head and the bolt's guide rail should just come off, like that. And then to separate these two, just twist to the right, twist the guide rail to the right, and pull off. And this is really as far as you need to take it apart. I've never had to take it apart more than this because I've never found powder residue further than down here on the firing pin. Powder and primer residue. But if you ever wanted to take it apart further, just find a block of wood or something, push down on the firing pin carefully as to not to bend it, and then twist the cocking piece off, and then let off, and then you'll have everything in their individual components. But to reassemble, just do everything in the reverse. Put this back on. I'm doing this from behind the camera, so it's real strange. There we go. Fit this back on. Give it a good wiggle. There's some amount of finagling when it comes to the reassembly of the Mosin Nagant bolt. See, for example, you have to twist slightly and then fit that in. And then make sure that the bolt head goes into the bolt handle. That piece should go into the recess there. And now you can measure firing pin protrusion. So take your little measuring tool here and all those notches. The first notch here should be should measure minimum, and so your firing pin should contact the surface, and this one does. Obviously, my camera has really poor, and it has no focus whatsoever, so I apologize. And the second groove right here should measure maximum, so it should not touch that. So I have to do that on camera, and you should see some visible clearance. And I do, but you guys probably can't. But this bolt has proper firing pin protrusion. So to put it back into the rifle, you have to put it into the cocked position again. So to do that, hold everything together and twist to the right. Like that. Make sure everything's still together, which it is. And then you just put it back into the rifle by inserting it back into the bolt guides and then depressing the trigger, and it will just slide forward. And there you go. To load the Mosin Nagant rifle, you can do so by one of two ways. The fastest, and obviously the best way to load on the battlefield, would be using what's called a stripper clip. It holds 5 rounds, it's a piece of steel. It's similar to the Mauser clip, but it's modified to hold rimmed rounds. The Russians used 7.62 by 54mm rimmed cartridges. And the rims, it can only be loaded one way because the rims overlap one another. The rims on this one are ahead of this one, which is ahead of this one, which is ahead of this one. And finally, this one has nothing on the bottom, so it kind of flops like that. And that's the way it goes in. So to load, pull back the bolts, insert the clip into the guides, and now here's the tricky part. What you have to do is you have to tilt it back at an angle, and then use your pointer and thumb to lever it in, like that. That was actually pretty smooth. Normally sometimes they go in smoothly, sometimes they're tough to push in. With the clip in, you cannot push the bolt forward. The clip will not eject, so you have to take that and toss it. And then from here, you can just go about doing your business. Alternatively, you can use up to 5 loose rounds and just insert them into the magazine one by one. That's 5. And there you go. If you're really worried about ammo consumption, because of the way this weapon works, I won't explain it now, but you can single load this weapon. I'll demonstrate that now. It is actually safe to single load, as far as I know. And there you go. Just a quick note about the loading and magazine system of the Mosin Nagant while it's still relevant. The Mosin Nagant, as I mentioned, uses rimmed rounds, where there's a rim at the base of the cartridge, and that allows for what's called rim lock, a potentially deadly condition on the battlefield, where the round at the top, which is trying to be chambered, is obstructed by the rim of the round underneath it. So to get around that, the Russians in the Mosin Nagant use what's called an interrupter, which you see there. It's a tetrahedral shaped piece of metal, and it basically separates the topmost round, which is about to be chambered, from the ones in the magazine, and I'll demonstrate that. So here is a round ready to be chambered, and I just did. And then, but if you push the round past the interrupter, which is spring-loaded, as you can see here, no matter how many times you move the bolt forward, it will not catch that round. But what happens is when you close the bolts and you turn it down, the bolts pushes in this spring, which allows the round to pop up ready to be fed after the case is ejected, like that. So you actually should be able to hear it as I close the bolts. There, that little click you heard was the round moving upward as the interrupter interrupter spring was bumped. So now obviously it's ready to be chambered. And what this allows you to do, in theory, and in practice actually, I know this for a fact, is to load 4 rounds past the interrupter and close the bolt on an empty chamber. And that allows you to get around this potentially hazardous safety, which I'm not a real big fan of. To unload the Mosin Nagant rifle, you can do so by one of 2 ways. The most obvious is to just cycle the bolts until nothing remains in the magazine. The second way, which is perhaps a bit more convenient, is to release the floor plate, and that's done by pulling back on this latch here and then just pulling the floor plate down. The pressure from the magazine spring will help you along the way, and your rounds will just fall out because of gravity. Now, if you have a round above the interrupter, like I do here, you have to push it past the interrupter for it to fall out, like that. So there you go. You can see the target so much easier. Solid hit, solid hit. You can see the target so much easier from this from this bench. Yeah. All right, I demand a rerun. Solid, solid hit. Not too bad. I only got 4 rounds, but I'm going to see how quickly I can rack them off. Go, Chuck. Yeah, 5 rounds.
We gotta get Joe's favorite speed thrower and tool there.
Stage line, returning equipment to its proper owners and key cards to the front office when you're done.
That's my favorite.
Range, you really worked it out.
I missed the 200. I really missed the 200.
Front sight in Nevada.
Yeah?
They got practical rifle from and then precision rifle from 400 to 1,000.
Oh, that's gotta be beautiful.
Oh man.
Alright, center target. Oh, that's gotta be fun. That has gotta be fun.
I've judged that.
You put about down range, everybody gets a plus.
Well, yeah, you have to. Yeah, that must be awesome. I would love to do something like that.
Alright, cool. George. He's pulling low for some reason. He's probably jerking or flinching, but at least he got 2 in. And here's my 5-round group. I was shooting relatively fast, so
I got to next time better, I think.
yeah.